Hi, thank you for watching. My name is Glenn Morgan and this is We the Govern. Today's topic is going to be about reparations. And if that becomes public policy, I'm going to tell you who should pay. All right, today we're going to be talking about a public policy idea, and specifically the policy idea that we're talking about today is reparations. And I remember first time I ever really discussed this in any kind of a serious way was back when I was in college in the early 90s, because I believe there was a congressman who had proposed a bill in DC about reparations. And so it's back in the news again today. But very specifically, why I was interested in this is because I live in Washington State, and I'm always interested in what the Washington State Democratic Party has to say in their policy platform. And the reason is they basically control all levers of government in Washington State. They control the governor's office, the Senate, and the State House. And so they recently passed their platform a couple months ago. And specifically, if you looked at their platform on line 1553, they endorse and promote the idea of reparations. It's a study for reparations, but basically it's promoting this idea of reparations. And they're not alone in this idea. If you actually look at the federal platform for the nation, for the Democratic Party, they're talking about making it part of their platform. If you look at other states around America today, the Democratic Party platform includes reparations in those platforms. And in the recent Democratic presidential primary, a number of their leading candidates also supported reparations. So this has become a mainstream idea within the Democratic Party as their platform, and as such, you should consider anything on their platform as a potential public policy in the future, and that's why I was interested in it. But when we talk about reparations, oftentimes what we're talking about, or the idea that tends to come to mind, at least if you're more history-oriented, is the reparations in modern times that came out of World War I. At the end of World War I, the Germans had lost the war, and the Allies at the time, France and England in particular, were pushing to impose reparations very aggressively on the Germans. Interestingly enough, at the time, America was less positive about this reparations idea, but the Europeans were very strong. The victors in that war wanted to make sure that Germany paid reparations. And many historians believe that in the Treaty of Versailles, where reparations were included in it, that this sowed the seeds for future conflict, which led to the next round of major reparations in the world today, which was coming out of World War II. Germany again had to pay reparations to victims of the Holocaust, particularly victims of Jewish descent who had been murdered and killed in the gas chambers and in the other events and activities that occurred at the end of that war. And so there were reparations involved in that whole process, a conversation that's actually still going on today, and finding old property and returning it to the original owners. However, it's not just Germany where reparations have been involved in recent times. In America, there were reparations paid to American citizens of Japanese descent who had been interned in camps during World War II. And those reparations were paid back in the 1980s. That was a recent example of reparations. Even more recently, if you go to the island of Guam, the nation of Japan has paid reparations to people who lived on the island of Guam during the military occupation of Guam by Japan. Japan has actually paid reparations from World War II to a number of different groups of people around the world, in Korea and the Philippines and elsewhere, as a result of that war. So reparations as policy are fairly well known. They do happen, and what makes this one different, at least in the context of public policy today, is that the reparations that we're talking about specifically have to do to reparations for Africans who had been enslaved in America, so descendants of people who had been slaves in America. Now, as a public policy standpoint, reparations really raise three basic questions, the idea of reparations, and that is, first of all, who's going to get paid? Because you can't really expect that everybody gets paid reparations. You have to identify the people who are actually descendants of slaves. That would be the whole basis of this policy, so you're going to have to identify who they are. It can't just be race-based, because somebody that comes from Nigeria as a recent immigrant in the last year, it doesn't seem fair or honest or just that they would be getting reparations, and you'd want to be directing it towards those who are actually descendants of slaves, at least if the logic of this policy would dictate that. The other question is, how much do they get? How much should be paid? That's usually part of a discussion of any reparations, is how much money is involved, because ultimately that's what this is about. It's about transferring money. So how much money goes to people who are going to be paid these reparations? And finally, the question that I'm going to focus on in this video, which is who should pay. And that really does matter, because if you have nobody who can pay, then the whole conversation's moot and there's really nothing to talk about. So the question is, it could be a lot of money, so finding out who can pay or who should pay is very important. And normally, it's going to be somebody who's actually responsible for the crime that, for which reparations are being paid. In the case of Guam, it was clearly the nation of Japan that was paying for the war crimes from World War II. In the case of the Holocaust, it was clearly Germany that was paying for war crimes of World War II as well. In the case of the Japanese internment camps, it was the American government that was paying for their policy towards Japanese Americans who had been interned in those camps. But when we talk about slavery and reparations in this context, since slavery ended 160 years ago, there's nobody alive today that was directly responsible for slavery in the way that it was practiced here in America. So there's nobody left to collect reparations from. And in America, which is very common, this is common now in the Western world in general, we don't typically make children pay for the crimes of their parents. The only exception to this is the national debt. We do take debt of today and we shove it down on future generations. So with that one exception of debt, we don't tend to make future generations pay for the crimes of current generations or past generations. This is a concept that exists in North Korea, where they will punish people for multiple generations for failing to support the government. But that's not what we do in America. So this is a problem when it comes to crafting rational public policy around reparations. However, there is an argument that might be made is, what about a corporate entity? What if there's a business today or a corporate entity of some kind that exists today that specifically profited from slavery or endorsed slavery back in the 1860s? If we could find that corporation, that corporate entity, somebody that's still in existence today, then that would be a good place to start when it comes to who should pay for reparations. And doing my research, and you can do research as well, you'll find that there is one corporate entity that exists today, that existed back when slavery was dominant policy in the southern parts of America anyway. And so there is one corporation that still exists today. And if you're a student of history, it's no surprise. That's right, it is the Democratic Party. They have existed, they're the longest existing political party in this country. They've existed since the early 1800s. And when you go back and study history, and this is all public record, so it's easy for anybody who wants to do the research to verify what I'm saying, you can look at the party platforms of the Democratic Party going back to 1840, where they specifically endorsed slavery and were strongly opposed to abolitionism. The whole idea of abolition, the abolition movement in America, was to free slaves. It was a big deal in America, especially in the northern states, and it actually was the movement that broke up the Whig Party and helped create the Republican Party specifically as an abolition movement to abolish slavery in America today. The Democratic Party was completely on the opposite side of that argument, to the point that a huge faction of the Democratic Party, mostly in the southern states where slavery was still practiced, broke away and decided to have a formal civil war that they were willing to fight, and hundreds of thousands of Americans died to fight and defend slavery on the southern side. The Democratic Party was going to defend slavery. Now, when you look back on this, the other thing to remember is that the Democratic Party, in addition to being the party that formed the Confederacy, that supported slavery for many decades, they also, when given the opportunity, they opposed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in America today. Now, at the time, the Confederate portions of the Democratic Party couldn't vote on that. So we're talking just the Democrats that were in the North. The Republicans basically voted to get rid of slavery, and they were unanimous in their desire to eliminate slavery, and they were able to convince a few Democrats to cross over, but their primary opposition was the Democratic Party, and they did not want to abolish slavery. They opposed the 13th Amendment, and so that was really part of their party. In addition, when you look at the 14th Amendment, which basically gave freed slaves full civil rights, it was opposed by every single Democrat in Congress in 1868. they opposed that. It was supported by the Republicans, and it was completely opposed by every single Democrat who served in Congress at the time. And when you look even further out till 1870, when the 15th Amendment was passed by Congress, giving freed slaves the right to vote, this was also unanimously opposed by Democrats in America. And the Democrat Party always fought against all the Reconstruction efforts in the South that were occurring during this time, and they opposed the ability of freed slaves to vote. This was really part of their identity. And the Reconstruction in the South was a big deal because the Republicans of the North, the victorious northern states, wanted to make sure that there was some Reconstruction in the South. That's what they called it, Reconstruction. But part of that was to ensure that the recently freed slaves had the opportunity to participate in civic society, that they were able to be treated as full citizens, which included the right to vote. And so the North intervened in the South to make sure that the right to vote existed in the South that had been denied to these people. And that's why when you look at the voting results in the South, there were a lot of African Americans who were elected to the local state legislatures. The right to vote was a big deal. It came about because of these amendments to the Constitution. The Republicans were very supportive of that. And it created great anxiety and anger by the Democratic Party in the South, who were strongly offended by the ability of recently freed slaves to vote. Unless you doubt this, this is very clearly part of their promotion and political communication at the time in the South. They clearly identified themselves as the Democrat Party for the white man and the Republican Party as the party of African Americans, recently freed slaves, and of course carpetbaggers. And this is something that the Democrat Party widely distributed and promoted in the South. Unfortunately, political violence became very commonplace in the southern states at the time. The worst example of this was the Colfax Massacre in 1873 in Missouri. I do encourage anybody who wants to understand more about that time period to go back and look this up. I mean, this was clear political violence. We have political violence today on the streets in Seattle and Portland and elsewhere, but that is child's play compared to the type of political violence that existed in the South during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And specifically, most of this violence were white Democrats who were opposed white and black Republicans, and particularly the black Republicans who recently freed slaves. And in this case, the Colfax Massacre, vote fraud had been alleged, and the Republican votes, many of them had been basically taken and thrown into the river and recently destroyed. And so the recently freed slaves and white Republicans all got together, and they wanted to go get their votes. They wanted to make sure their votes were counted. And as a result, as part of that conflict, the white Democrats murdered over 150, mostly black Republicans. There were a few white Republicans in that group as well. And it was a terrible massacre. Basically, the North was shocked by this. The Republican Party was incredibly upset by this. It actually resulted in a horrible Supreme Court case at the time. And it was kind of the culmination of just multiple years of violence by the Democratic Party in the South to ensure that freed slaves couldn't vote or participate in the political process. And it was pretty amazing. When you read it, it's hard to even imagine when you go back and you read about what happened back then. But this was a Democratic Party, and this is who they were. And this ultimately led to their enforcement of voter intimidation tactics in the South as the Democratic Party got control of these states after Reconstruction. They were going to make sure that any black Republican who dared to come forward, who was actually willing to vote, they were going to make sure that they voted the way that the white Democrats wanted them to vote at the time, the Democratic Party. And so this is the context behind the Democratic Party's support for slavery at the time. And when you look back on their efforts post-Reconstruction, they feel like they basically prevailed. They were able to regain control of their party and this territory. And one of the ways they did that was suppressing the black Republican vote in the South. In 1902, for example, in Virginia, Democrats passed a very aggressive law which disenfranchised over 90% of black voters at the time. And that was not unusual. They were always finding ways, Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, all kinds of ways to suppress the vote. And in 1924, the Democratic Party convention in New York City was actually called the Klan Bank because of the obvious influence of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan at the time, on Democrat Party policies. Now, there was a division in the party. Not everybody in the party was a racist. Not everybody in the party supported suppressing black Republican votes, but it was a dominant platform, and within the Democratic Party, that was their approach. That was what they supported, and that's what they did. So this comes into even less than 100 years ago. They were still involved in this, pushing these rules and these laws and doing everything that they could to suppress the vote of black Republicans in the South. And this even influenced places like Washington State, which was not involved in the Civil War to any substantial degree, but people who were coming out and immigrating to Washington State, well, it was still a territory. Specifically, I'm thinking of the Bush family, William Owen Bush, who was a well-known Republican, and he was one of the first Republican legislators in Washington State. He was the son of an African immigrant who had been enslaved in India and had come to America, and they moved out to Washington State because when they first went to Oregon, Oregon had very racist land use policies, and they wouldn't allow them to own land there, so they moved to Washington State. And when Washington State became a state in 1889, during the first legislative session, the very first African-American legislator was a Republican, William Bush, and he decided that one of the first things he would do is push through legislation that clarified civil rights laws for people who lived in Washington State to ensure that there was no doubt they were allowed to own land. And the only reason he was pushing this was because the Democrat Party's policies were becoming frighteningly common for the rest of the country. And as a strong Republican himself, he really wanted to push this forward. Now, interestingly enough, because this is kind of just an interesting Washington State historical fact, is that recently, within the last 15 years or so, the Republicans in the legislature have tried to pass like a piece of legislation that would recognize William Owen as the first black African-American legislator in Washington State, and to recognize him in the rotunda of the Capitol. There's these little areas where you could have some historical reference and kind of acknowledgement of kind of this path-breaking founding father of Washington State. And the Democrats have always opposed that. So interestingly enough, kind of some of this policy still seems to linger to this day. However, when it comes to then policy ideas, when we're talking about reparations, the question of who pays is the question that needs to be answered, I think. And I don't think this is a great policy. I think there's a lot of problems with the policy. I think it opens up a can of worms into all kinds of other public policy debates. But if you're going to have reparations, and that's going to become public policy, there's only one corporate entity in existence in America today that clearly must be the one forced to pay, and that is the Democratic Party. And it's the Democratic Party, and it's all of their main supporters and donors. If you've supported the Democratic Party and you have the resources to do so, then if reparations becomes policy, those are the people who should be paying for this reparations policy. Thank you for watching. If you want to learn more, go to wethegovern.com. Don't forget to subscribe, and please add your comments below if you think I've missed something. I always try to respond, and I appreciate anything you have to say. And remember, the future belongs to those who show up.